remember, I'm the one that ended Nord Stream 2, going to a place called Germany, come to think of it. I'm sorry I did that. But I ended Nord Stream 2. Nobody else did.
The Donald Trump administration has essentially been boasting of the fact that its policies are doing serious damage to Europe. Now, it's not new for the US government to carry out policies that exploit Europe and benefit the US at the expense of its so-called allies. But what is different about the Trump administration is that Trump so frequently says the quiet part loud. And unlike Democrats, who often say that US policy is supposedly motivated by democracy and human rights, Trump administration officials say openly, no, we are an empire, we are a hegemon, we don't act benevolently, we act in order to support our own economic interests, to exploit other countries in a zero-sum game. In the Make America Great Again MAGA view of the world, one side has to win, that is the United States, and the other side has to lose. And this applies to everyone, including longtime US allies. The perfect symbol of this was in June when Donald Trump had a meeting in the White House with the leader of Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And there, sitting right in front of the leader of Germany, Trump boasted of sabotaging the Nord Stream pipeline. This was a pipeline project that was launched by the German government to connect Russia to Germany, because it was Germany that wanted cheap energy from Russia in order to power German industry. This is often referred to as a Russian project, but in reality, Nord Stream was a joint project between, yes, Russia, but also companies in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. This was a European civilian energy project. And yet, listen to this clip here in which Trump is sitting in front of Germany's chancellor and he boasts of, quote, ending and stopping the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, keep in mind here that what Trump didn't mention is that in 2022, those pipelines were blown up. They were sabotaged. At that time, Joe Biden was president. But listen to Trump take credit here for ending the pipelines.
On Russia, are you willing to put more pressure on Putin to end the war by imposing new sanctions on Russia and also on China?
Well, remember, I'm the one that ended Nord Stream 2, going to a place called Germany, come to think of it. I'm sorry I did that. But I ended Nord Stream 2. Nobody else did.
This is how the US government treats its so-called allies in Europe. It boasts of sabotaging civilian energy projects in Europe because, as Trump admitted after in this meeting in the White House, the US wants Europe to be dependent on US energy, on importing liquefied natural gas and oil from the United States, not importing pipeline gas and oil from Russia.
That's the largest, essentially the largest pipeline in the world, going to Germany and other countries. And by the way, we have so much oil and gas, you will not be able to buy it all. I mean, you literally, we have so much, and I hope we're going to make that a part of our trade deal because we have more than anybody else. We have actually the most by far in the world, probably double what anyone else has. So we'll work on that. I'm sure that's something we'll discuss today.
So while the US government tells Europe to be so afraid of Russia, the US government is the one actually exploiting Europe. And this is true also under Democrats. But the difference is that Joe Biden claimed, I'm your best friend, I'm going to do everything I can to support you, Europe. Whereas Trump is no longer even hiding it. He's spitting in Europe's face and telling them they should be grateful. So to begin here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this Nord Stream case because I think it's the perfect illustration of the extremely unequal relations between the US and Europe. So what exactly was Nord Stream? This was a series of 4 pipelines in 2 different groups that went through the Baltic Sea, connecting Russia to Germany, circumventing Eastern Europe. There were 2 series of 2 pipelines. Nord Stream 1 was completed in 2011, and Nord Stream 2 finished construction in 2021, but it was never actually used. And then in September 2022, the pipelines were blown up. They were sabotaged. And officially, no government has taken credit for blowing up the pipelines. However, the renowned American journalist Seymour Hersh, who won the Pulitzer Prize, the top prize in US journalism, he published an article citing sources in the US government who said that the US military blew up Nord Stream. Now, officially, the US government has denied this, and the CIA used newspapers like the Washington Post to pin the blame on Ukraine. However, even according to the CIA narrative, and by the way, we should be very skeptical of the CIA, given how often it has lied throughout history, including about the Iraq War. Remember, weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. But despite the long history of CIA lying, even if you accept the CIA's narrative, they admit that the US government knew that Ukraine was preparing this plan to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. So even according to their own narrative, the US government played a role in green lighting this operation, because Ukraine would not carry out an operation like this if it did not have at least the implicit support of the US government. At the United Nations Security Council, Russia introduced a resolution that called for an independent international investigation into the sabotage of Nord Stream. However, the Western countries opposed this. Only 3 countries at the UN Security Council supported the call for an international independent investigation. Those countries were Brazil, China, and Russia. The West was opposed. The government of Denmark briefly conducted an investigation, but then they closed the investigation and they did not blame anyone. The government of Sweden did the exact same thing. They briefly launched an investigation and then quietly closed it without blaming anyone. Now, mere hours after the pipelines were blown up, the prominent Polish politician Radek Sikorski tweeted a photo of the sabotage, and he said, quote, "Thank you, USA," end quote. Sikorski was previously both the defense minister and the foreign minister of Poland, and he's closely linked to the US government. He's a close ally of the US, and his wife is the neoconservative US columnist Anne Applebaum, who is closely linked to the US State Department. So the fact that he was publicly celebrating and thanking the United States was very symbolic. But today, in 2025, it seems like so many people have forgotten about this incident that only happened 3 years ago. And now Donald Trump is in the White House and boasting of how he ended the pipeline while he sits in the front of the leader of Germany. And it's not even a big news story. I didn't see any major media outlets cover these comments made by Trump. Because really, it's so normalized, this idea that the US treats its so-called allies in Europe like vassals. Because again, this project Nord Stream was launched by Germany. It was actually originally not a Russian idea. It was an idea that was pushed by German industrialists during the previous government of the longtime Chancellor Angela Merkel. Because Germany has historically been a major industrial power, although US policies are leading to rapid deindustrialization of the German economy, along with the US pushing for Europe to have an extremely antagonistic line against China. So all of these US policies are exploiting Europe, benefiting US corporations at the expense of Europe, and they're sabotaging Europe's relationship with its most important trading partner, China, and what was previously its most important energy partner, Russia. And that was why Angela Merkel wanted cheap energy from Russia in order to power industry in Germany. But Donald Trump himself admitted in this meeting with Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz that he instead wants Germany and the rest of Europe to buy oil and gas from the United States, not from Russia. Trump recalled a conversation he had with the previous German Chancellor Merkel, in which he complained that the US military was supposedly protecting Germany. You know, the US has thousands of troops and many military bases in Germany. And Trump complained and he said, "You are paying billions of dollars for oil and gas from Russia. Instead, you should be buying that oil and gas from US companies."
But I'm the one that stopped the pipeline. It's called Nord Stream 2. Until I came along, nobody ever heard, not one person in this room ever heard of Nord Stream 2. You probably did, yes, because it went to Germany. He's the only one that heard.
This was a mistake.
But I stopped him. I stopped it. Yeah, and you've said that openly.
Yeah.
It was a mistake because, and I used to go with Angela. I'd say, well, wait a minute. We're spending all this money to defend you against Russia, and then you're giving Russia billions of dollars a month. What kind of a deal is that? You know, which was, but you said it better than anybody else. I appreciate it. But I'm the one that stopped it. And that was the biggest economic development job, if you want to call it that, in the history, think of it, in the history of Russia. That was a massive, it's the biggest pipeline in the world. Going to go all over Europe, not only to Germany. You know, they were Germany, but then they were branching off all over to Europe. Nobody ever heard of it. Not one person of you heard of it. And I stopped it. It was dead.
Back in 2019, during his first term as US president, Trump imposed sanctions on any company that would work with the Russian gas giant Gazprom in order to complete the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines. Again, the Nord Stream 1 pipelines were finished in 2011. The Nord Stream 2 pipelines were not finished until 2021, and they were never used because of the threats by the US government. During Trump's first term, he was blatantly meddling in the internal affairs of Germany and essentially telling Germany that it could not continue to deepen its economic relations with Russia. And in 2018, as he was threatening Germany over the Nord Stream 2 construction, Trump referred to Germany as a captive of Russia, complaining that Germany was buying too much oil and gas from Russia. Because in reality, what Trump wanted is Germany and the rest of Europe to be a captive of the United States. He wanted to replace dependency on Russia with dependency on the US. And this is exactly what happened later. Of course, the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed in 2022. That was after Trump left office. Trump left office in January of 2021, and Joe Biden entered. But in February of 2022, Biden warned Russia, and he said, if you invade Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will no longer exist. He said that the US had ways to stop it, which was obviously a hint that Nord Stream would be destroyed, which it was in September, just a few months later. Listen to this very revealing clip from Biden.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
So again, this says so much about how the US sees its relations with Europe, and not just under Trump and the Republicans, but also under Biden and the Democrats. They do not treat their so-called allies in Europe as leaders of sovereign, independent countries. They treat them as vassals. And we have video clips of 2 US presidents boasting of how they ended and stopped a pipeline project that was built by multiple European companies in not only Russia, but also Germany, France, and the Netherlands. And it was sabotaged, and the US government didn't care. It did not allow them to have their own independent commercial relations because the US empire does not see Europe as its friendly partner, but as its subservient proxies. And the results of the sabotage of Nord Stream have been completely predictable. The US has become the largest exporter of oil and liquefied natural gas to Europe. US fossil fuel corporations have profited. As of the beginning of 2024, the United States provided nearly half, over 47% of the liquefied natural gas, LNG, imported by the European Union. The US also was the source of 17% of the petroleum oil imported by the EU. Using official EU data from Eurostat, I created charts that illustrate the massive shift in Europe's energy supply in the past few years. Throughout the 2010s, Russia was by far the largest exporter of oil to the EU. Russia exported over 10 times more oil to the EU than the United States did. But the situation changed completely in 2022 with the proxy war in Ukraine, which was not simply a war between Russia and Ukraine. It was a war between Russia on one side and NATO on the other. And of course, NATO is led by the United States. In response to that war, the EU boycotted Russian energy. And what was the result? The United States became the largest exporter of both oil and liquefied natural gas to Europe. Previously, in the 2010s, Norway and Saudi Arabia were tied as the second largest exporter of oil to the EU. But a decade later, the US has overtaken Russia and Norway and Saudi Arabia as the number one exporter. Something very similar happened with the EU's imports of natural gas. In the 2010s, the US basically did not export any natural gas to the EU, almost none. But as of 2023, the US is the second largest exporter of natural gas to the EU after Norway, which is actually in Europe. And Russia has gone from being by far the largest exporter of natural gas to the EU to now exporting comparatively little. However, the difference is even starker when you look at liquefied natural gas, LNG. Here, the US is by leaps and bounds the number one exporter to the EU. And this is because the US can't send gas on a pipeline across the Atlantic Ocean. That would just be too far. That's what Norway does because, again, Norway is in Europe and it sends natural gas through a pipeline. But instead, companies from the US liquefy natural gas, they put it on ships, they send it across the Atlantic, and Europe imports it. And it's more expensive. So Europe is now importing much more expensive LNG from the US. US corporations are profiting, and it's even worse for the environment. It's making climate change even worse. And while we're on the subject of the environment, I should point out that the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines was an ecocidal event, completely catastrophic for the environment. The United Nations reported that the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines resulted in the planet's largest ever human-caused release of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is even worse than carbon dioxide in terms of exacerbating climate change. So this was a complete catastrophe for the planet. Now, speaking of Western hypocrisy vis-a-vis climate change, the German government had to reopen coal-fired power plants because it had a shortage of energy due to, one, its boycotting of cheap Russian energy, and two, because Germany shut down its nuclear plants. When it comes to climate change, coal is by far the worst source of energy. It emits more carbon dioxide than all other sources of energy. And on the other side, you know what emits the fewest emissions? Nuclear. Nuclear is the cleanest, greenest form of energy there is. And yet, ironically, it was the so-called Green Party of Germany that advocated for closing down all of the green nuclear power plants, and now Germany is reopening extremely anti-green coal plants. And also, the so-called Green Party of Germany is extremely pro-war, extremely militarist, extremely pro-NATO, anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine. All of these policies are anti-green. They've made climate change much worse and done significant damage to the environment. In addition, of course, to the millions of lives that have been lost due to these militaristic policies. This just shows how much of a joke the so-called Green Party of Germany is. However, I should point out that not all Green parties in the world are like this. In the US, for instance, the US Green Party is very progressive, very anti-war, and the US Green Party recognizes that the US military is the single largest consumer of oil on Earth and one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters on Earth. So you cannot support the US military and NATO and war and also actually care about the environment and opposing climate change. It's a completely contradictory policy. In fact, even the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a hawkish anti-Russia think tank, acknowledged that Europe is becoming a vassal of the United States in a policy paper called The Art of Vassalization. And it talked about how the proxy war in Ukraine has given the US even more leverage and influence over Europe's affairs. And this is not some kind of fringe anti-war group in Europe. This is a very mainstream think tank, the European Council on Foreign Relations. It is funded by multiple EU member states. These are the elites of Brussels who are complaining about the fact that they've lost more and more of their independence. And what is the goal of the US empire in all of this? Well, it was spelled out very clearly by the late US imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is extremely influential in US foreign policy circles, and he served as the US government's national security advisor under President Jimmy Carter. In 1997, Brzezinski published the book The Grand Chessboard: American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. He wrote this a few years after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, and in this book, he boasted that the US was the only superpower in the world and that the US had a global empire that controlled pretty much every major region of the world. And he talked about strategies that the US empire could use to prevent the rise of another superpower that could challenge the unipolar dominance of the United States. This was the unipolar moment. And in this book, Brzezinski warned about potential scenarios that could lead to challengers to US global dominance. He wrote, quote, "The United States may have to determine how to cope with regional coalitions that seek to push America out of Eurasia, thereby threatening America's status as a global power," end quote. And Brzezinski's imperialist view of the world was influenced by the British imperial strategist Mackinder, one of the fathers of geopolitics, who was theorizing ways for the British Empire to exercise control over the world. And Mackinder famously argued that Eurasia was the center of the world island and that empires needed to control Eurasia in order to control the world. And this was something that US imperial strategists borrowed from British imperial strategists after World War II. Now, in this book, Brzezinski warned of the possibility of, quote, "a European-Russian accommodation to exclude America from the continent," end quote. And he outlined what he saw as a dangerous scenario, which was, quote, "the possibility of a grand European realignment involving either a German-Russian collusion or a Franco-Russian entente," end quote. So he was really concerned about the possibility of Germany and Russia forming an alliance or France and Russia forming an alliance. This is something that the US empire has long been very afraid of, especially considering that Germany has an advanced manufacturing sector and Russia has huge supplies of cheap energy, so their partnership makes perfect economic sense. And in fact, this was one of the main reasons for the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, during the first Cold War against the Soviet Union. Washington was afraid that the new government in Germany could potentially have good relations or even an alliance with the Soviet Union. Of course, East Germany was an ally of the Soviet Union. So if you go to the NATO website, they openly admit this. They quote the first ever Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, who famously said that NATO was created, quote, "to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down," end quote. And today this remains the goal of NATO, to keep Russia out, the Germans down, and the US on top, allowing the US empire to subordinate the previous European empires to the US empire. And this strategy has obviously been doing significant damage to the economy of Europe. You now even have mainstream Western media outlets warning of the growing deindustrialization of Germany, which is the economic motor of Europe. And the reason for the deindustrialization of Germany and the economic problems is in large part due to the new Cold War against China and also Russia. The boycotting of cheap Russian energy, which was needed to power German industry and to make it competitive, but also the very antagonistic position that the West has taken against China, how the US has pressured Europe to attack China. So where is Germany going to export its cars? The German car industry has relied for decades on the massive Chinese market of 1.4 billion people. And yet now, more and more, the German government has been criticizing China, taking a hard line against China under pressure by the United States. And therefore, the German political class is doing damage to its own economy, antagonizing its largest trading partner at the behest of Washington. So this raises a fundamental question. Why is the European political class so dedicated to Atlanticism, to this cross-Atlantic, transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe, especially at a moment like now when the Trump administration is openly attacking Europe and spitting in the face of European leaders? And yet, what is their response? They're literally crying. The chairman of the Munich Security Conference broke out in tears in public in response to J.D. Vance's speech attacking him. I mean, this is the pitiful situation of the leadership in Europe, which is literally crying like children because they refuse to grow a spine and stand up to the US empire. And honestly, I think a big reason for this is economic. These European elites have sold out their own countries, their own populations, their own working class for their own economic interest. Rich Europeans have invested trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth into US assets, especially in the US stock market. As of 2024, Europeans owned around 15% of the total market capitalization of US equities, of the US stock market. And European investors have plowed into US assets, especially in the past decade, and in particular in the past few years, especially big tech stocks from the Magnificent Seven, these corporations like Meta and Apple and Amazon. European capitalist elites have invested much, much more than the elites of any other region of the world. In Asia, some of the elites have definitely invested in the US stock market, but Europe has taken it to a whole new level, investing trillions and trillions of dollars. And European capitalists hold huge parts of their wealth, their portfolio, in US assets. They are extremely overweight US assets. So it's in their economic interest to continue to subordinate their countries and their economies to the US because it serves their bottom line. They don't want to be more independent of the US because they're all in. If foreign investors start to sell their US assets, their stocks and US bonds and real estate, it could lead to a significant fall, even a collapse in the price of US stocks, of US real estate, of US bonds, which would hurt the portfolios of all of these elites in Europe. Of course, there are also cultural reasons and historical reasons. Many elites in Europe, many politicians studied at elite universities in the United States, and they are close friends with people, with elites in the United States. But honestly, I think a lot of this has to do with their economic interests. As European economies became financialized in recent decades with the rise of neoliberalism and free market economics, this meant that many European elites became economically subordinated to the US economy, especially to the US financial sector and Wall Street, and also to the US big tech companies, because Europe does not have big tech corporations. Europe economically is entirely beholden to Silicon Valley, to Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, which are very popular in Europe, to Google, which owns YouTube. Google has huge influence over Europe's economy. Not to mention Amazon, which also is expanding across Europe, and not only Amazon in terms of selling things, but also Amazon Web Service, AWS, which oversees a lot of the cloud in Europe. So economically, Europe has become more and more subordinated to the US, and European capitalists have become entirely invested in the United States. They are the Comprador bourgeoisie, not the national bourgeoisie. They are not trying to advance the interests of their own nation. They are entirely economically wedded to the United States, and they see the interests of the US as their interests. And today there are a few European leaders like Emmanuel Macron in France who at least try to be a little more independent. He uses this rhetoric of supposedly being more independent, although at the end of the day, Macron in France almost always fall in line with the US empire. But even despite the political will that exists, which is very small, this process of becoming more independent of the US is going to take years, if not decades, because so many European elites, like Macron, who's a former investment banker and a millionaire, they're going to have to diversify their portfolio significantly, which they don't want to do because that would probably make them much poorer. And at the end of the day, these oligarchs care more about their personal wealth than the well-being of their countries, especially if you look at who these Western political leaders are. They're all oligarchs and plutocrats. France's President Macron was a banker. Italy's previous Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, was also a banker. Germany's current Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, was the chair of the German arm of BlackRock, the world's largest investment company based in New York City. And now Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, ran not only the Central Bank of Canada, but also the Central Bank of England, of another country. And before that, Mark Carney worked for Goldman Sachs, the US investment bank. And of course, the US president, Donald Trump, is a billionaire oligarch. All of these Western leaders are oligarchs, and they're entirely invested in Wall Street. And unless there is a significant radical shift in the political leadership in all of these countries, not just in Europe, but also in Canada and the US, it's going to be very difficult for them to move away from Wall Street because it's in their economic interest to continue to subordinate themselves to US finance capital. What the Trump administration is illustrating is how correct the former US Secretary of State and war criminal Henry Kissinger was when he famously said, quote, "It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal," end quote. Europe is learning this the hard way. And I hope the election of Donald Trump is a wake-up call, especially when Trump has taken off the mask and in the White House, he's inviting European heads of state, like the German chancellor, and he's boasting in their face about how he sabotaged their civilian energy infrastructure in order to benefit US fossil fuel corporations. If that's not going to be a wake-up call, I don't know what will be. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.